Well, I apologize for the slight delay. Traffic got me today. So anyway, the Naval Postgraduate School is down south there in Monterey Bay, and so just a quick trip up here was a really long drive. So anyway, thanks very much. Again, as my slide says, I'm retired military. My last two jobs was as the director of analysis and assessments in Iraq for U.S. Forces Iraq. And then the other one was that I was the division chief for the Force Directorate Analysis Division under GE8 for the Army. So two things that occurred in there is that I was looking at force structures very much and saw problems in the way that we were making decisions how to budget them. And therefore, I also was looking at how we were creating our budget policies for every year that we were trying to determine how much money to apply to each one of our system programs. So those are really the motivation for the problems that I was seeing, and I want to see if I could go ahead and solve it. And so what I'm going to present to you is a process integration. And again, as Mr. Ortiz has discussed, innovation in itself is basically the way we apply our certain nuggets of knowledge into different types of problems. And this is what really I'm trying to do. And so pretty much in this realm, I'm looking at basically management, budget management or fiscal management, and particularly for our Department of Defense. So I'll give you a quick overview of what I call effects-based fiscal planning is, the processes to go along with it, and then some recommendations for its implementation. We already have one taker, and I think we're going to be able to try to do it this coming fiscal year. Agenda. I'll spend a good bit on the solution overview and the walkthrough for it, and I think that should take up most of my 20 minutes. The problem, as I was talking about, was that our fiscal policies, we're continually reducing our budgets. And so our problem is, where do we put our actual money in when we make these decisions? The problem that we have then is our leadership, both in Congress and the Department of Defense, really don't have a good decision support system that can quantify those types of decisions. They basically go by their gut. They say, oh, this feels right, or this looks right, but they cannot quantify it to what degree that looks right or it feels right. So that's one of the problems that we have, and what I'm trying to find is that I think I have the solution for them. And again, because these types of problems are multidisciplinary, again, we're trying to use our creative thinking to try to find an innovation that tries to solve a very complex problem, okay, with many disciplines. So just a quick bottom line up front. And this is what effects-based fiscal planning really is. I'm basically integrating different types of efforts, okay? That is the operational effort, the idea of how to plan for fiscal budgets, and then using operations research and systems engineering. I happen to be an operations researcher, and I'm an associate professor in the systems engineering department, so I figured this is a pretty good tie-in. Okay, so again, my team actually has other members in it that look at computer sciences as well as economics. So we want to be able to answer two big questions. Based on our fiscal policies for the United States or DoD, how does that actually impact the way we can be successful in our military conflicts? The other one is that if we can't be successful based on our fiscal budget, the constraints that it provides us or gives us, then how do we change our fiscal policies? So those are two things we want to be able to answer with this process. And obviously, we already are in this environment where fiscal budgets are just going down the drain. Okay, we had sequestration last year. We furloughed people last year. We basically had to reduce DoD by about $32 billion last year. Okay, and this year was scheduled $57 billion. Now, they got way late, I think, mostly because we have coming up to an election. Okay, that was something that was not palatable to the government. Okay, so, and that's on both sides of the aisle. Okay, but when I was over there on the Army staff, we already knew that fiscal years 15 through 17 for the U.S. government and for DoD was going to be very, very difficult. The reduction in budget would continue, and it would be large reductions. So, one of the things I want to use as a background here are war games and business games. Okay, war games. We use them constantly when we look at planning for courses of action within the military. We do it all the time. Basically, we try to synchronize how we have resources and then how we apply them. And then we try to understand the impact of how we apply those resources, how we create our planning. And so we try to look and visualize what are the impacts of our decisions. Now, this is very applicable to business. Business, in retrospect, is always basically combative in nature. It is competitive. Okay? And so right now, businesses are using war games to understand how do they conduct themselves when they have problems, when there's turbulence in the market, when there is a change in view for their products. How do they manage? And so they're using games now. Okay, you can look on any internet. I'll guarantee you will find business games that are being used by larger and larger companies. So if we can do that in business, we can do it in DoD. So the first question from a systems engineering standpoint is, what's the capability I really want? And in this particular case, there are many, many instances from both Congress and DoD that continually says, hey, I want to understand how my decisions and how I budget is going to impact my readiness to conduct operations. Unfortunately, that is a huge, huge trace of going from what I say I'm going to fund this year to how well I'm going to do 10 or 15 or even 20 years from now. Because that's really when you're going to start seeing impact. I'll guarantee you that if you cut budgets this year, you won't really see the true impact of it next year or even the year after that. Because those programs of records for systems that are being developed now are already on a roll. They're on track. They're doing things already to develop it. But as you begin reducing those budgets, they begin having more and more impact as they go down in the out years. So the problem then is, how do I visualize this? The other part of this is then, how am I successful, and then how I mitigate if I'm not successful. So those are the two problems. If I were to look at systems engineering, there's always this V that I'm trying to get to. Now I'm going to stop when I finally get the concept discussion of what this effects-based fiscal planning process is going to be. But it's really a decomposition of the problem and then a reconstruction and assembly of the process. That's where I really want to go with in this piece. So we first look at, okay, if I take a look at those two main questions, that is, can I still be successful? Okay? And if I drop my dollars on this thing, if I reduce my dollars that I spend on my programs, how well am I going to do? What's the next piece? Well, if I'm not successful, then how do I alter the fiscal policies that I have that had that effect of not being successful? And again, brainstorming is one of those ideas. Mr. Ortiz brought it up. Thanks very much for setting me up so well. Okay? But brainstorming is one of those ideas of, what are all the things I need to know how to do? And so if you go ahead and just say, hey, I have to, one, frame the problem. I have to determine what are the measures of success. How am I going to look at whether or not something is feasible or infeasible? Those are certain problems. How do I create, what operational scenario do I want to look at? Now, I've concentrated on strategic plans and strategic scenarios because those are the things that are aggregate of all the things, of all the programs that happen within DoD. And then, of course, continued on, and how do I adjudicate this thing? Okay? How do I adjudicate the problems that I have within an operation? And so I begin applying simulations to this particular problem. So if I were to consolidate all my functions that my process that I'm trying to develop must have in it, I need to have a way to go ahead and conduct problem and measurements definitions. That's an easy one, okay? That's almost easy because we do it all the time. Test and evaluation, fairly easy to go ahead and do. Problem solving, many things to do. The military has what they call the military decision-making process, okay? And that's the first thing, problem definition. It is basically an art, as it is already. We do that already. Now, operational planning, we can do that from either from a business standpoint or from a military standpoint. The problem is then how must I adjudicate? And I'll get into the details of how we actually apply and manifest each one of these functions. And then how do I translate fiscal policies down to force structures, because they're the things that get entered into the operational plan. Someone has to execute an operational plan. That has to be the force structure, which is the one that we were really concentrating on. And then if it isn't any good, if I am not successful, what is the trade-off that I must have? And this is where we get into experimentation. I happen to be the Deputy Director for the Simulation Experiments and Efficient Design Center at Naval Postgraduate School. So what I'm using is simulation experimentation to go ahead and find the trade spaces for how do I change different factors in my problem. And then if those things are changed, how do they then impact new fiscal policy decisions? So I'm going to go through a process here where I'm going to walk through each one of those phases. I call them phase 0 through 4. Okay? Phases 2 through 4 are iterative in nature. So the first thing is obviously just objectives and measures of effectiveness that I want to go ahead and define. We can do that in many ways. Okay? This is phase 0. We can do this at the very, very beginning. Okay? We can do it eons out before we even start the whole process, but we can establish those. In fact, the military and DoD usually have a set of measures that they always want to have already made for any strategic plan that they create. So that one's pretty straightforward. Okay, and we can use different kinds of processes to do it. We can use systems engineering approaches. We can look at operations research or operations analysis, if you want to put it in that way. Test and evaluation always has that kind of deal. And the MDMP is basically that acronym that I was using for the military decision-making process. Okay? The next piece that we want to take a look at is these two things, phases 1 and phase 2. Okay? I want to use basically a simulation to adjudicate the operational plan. Okay? Because obviously those objectives go towards some operation. Okay, so I'm going to use those measures of effectiveness to go take a look at an operational plan for a particular force structure. Okay, those things are then implemented inside a simulation. Now we've used many inherently joint simulations or campaign level simulations within DoD. Okay, Department of Defense. The one I've been using as of late is the Joint Theater Level Simulation. Okay, it's a campaign level simulation. It's used internationally as well as nationally. Okay, so I kind of go towards that kind of simulation. But developing the database, developing the exercise and the war game within that simulation is a very difficult prospect. But that's the first phase. And we would look at that and say, okay, if I have my present budget, that is that this is the budget I have, and so therefore I'm going to use the force structure that I currently have. So that's the current phase. Okay? I can go ahead and develop that simulation and then run it. And then collect data that looks at the measures of effectiveness. Now, the second part of this, the phase 2 part then, is what if I have a new budget? What if I have a new fiscal policy that is now implemented that changes the budgets that I have for my programs? What's the new force structure that has to be created from this? Okay, now this is when it gets kind of tricky, because if I have a fiscal policy that changes the budgets for each one of my programs, and I want to look at the out years, let's say 10 years from now, for the same operation, what does my new force structure look like? What we've been using are seminar war games. Basically a lot of smart people in DoD and in government, and how they look at the fiscal budget, and then how does it trickle down to the separate programs of record for each one of the developmental systems that we may have. That's a seminar war game. Okay, basically they're using subject matter experts to game this particular possibility, and then try to understand what does a force structure look like then. Now, with that new force structure, we re-implemented it into a simulation, and then run it again, and then take measures. And we conduct a comparative analysis for that. Now, if the difference between the two analyses, okay, between the two runs is significant, we want to look at what the trade space is. What can we change? What can we change within these factors that are available to us? That is that, how do we change doctrine? How do we change tactics, techniques, and procedures for our operational force? How do we change the way we have our force structure organized? Okay, the organization is even important per force structure. Okay, not only what are the separate systems in it, but the force structure itself in the way it is organized. We can do that through computer experimentation. Okay, and we've done this already because I actually executed one for Afghanistan. So I've already done this, okay, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the next step after this is that once I start looking at trade spaces and I look at trade-off analysis, I then go back to phase 4, basically the last phase, and I say, okay, here's what you must have as trade space. Here's what you have. You cannot buy any more of system A. You need to buy more of system B. Okay? In order for that to happen, new budget policies have to be put in place. It goes back to phase 2 then. From phase 4, I have to then determine what fiscal policies have to be implemented. It goes back down to a trickle down of what are the new budgets for each one of the programs of record. So it keeps on going through this until I get some stasis where I'm getting basically the same kinds of answers. Because that experimentation piece in phase 3 tells me that you have to have success. And this usually takes about 300 days to go ahead. That's my estimate for it right now. And then the proof of concept, we already have all these things in place. I'm going to go through them real quickly. The military decision-making process, we've already done this before. Okay? This is the mission analysis planning when we look at courses of actions for war games. We have a lot of simulations already in place to include the joint theater level simulation. So we already have all these pieces. Seminar war games. Some of our partners in industry have already been conducting this. Okay, the Center for Strategic Budget Assessments did one for fiscal policies to look at new force structures. And as I said, from an experimentation standpoint, we've already done this. I've developed new types of experimental designs for simulations. They're called saturated nearly orthogonal latent hypercubes. This is one of the lesser types over here. Basically, I can say that I can take a look at 17 factors, but I only need 18 runs or 18 data points to go ahead and get a convincing good analysis based on that information. And of course, you know, as I said, I already did this for Afghanistan because they were taking a look at what is a good contingency plan to go ahead and get out of Afghanistan and what are the enabling forces that need to be in place in order to keep some sort of stability as we left. So we already did this. This is part of that analysis in an unclassified mode. And so in summary, we're already in austere environments. We have the processes that we need in place. We have to put them together as one implementation. And I already have a taker from the U.S. Air Force who says they want to do it this fiscal year. So we're going to take a good look at this thing. I already got the team already assembled. And based on this, do I have any questions? Because I think Mr. Ortiz wants to award me something, okay? Because I've been wanting one of those. Okay, so any questions? Okay, thanks very much.
It's a pleasure for me just giving this to you. It was so interesting.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.